I was 62 years old the morning my accountant called me while my wife was sitting right across the breakfast table, watching me with those soft brown eyes I had once believed were the most honest thing I'd ever seen. He said 4 words that made the coffee turn cold in my hand. 4 words I will never forget as long as I live. He said, "Robert, stop signing things." I didn't move. I didn't react. I set the phone down gently, looked up at my wife, and smiled. She smiled back. And somewhere behind her eyes, just for a fraction of a second, I saw something flicker, something I couldn't name then, but I understand now. She was watching to see if I knew. I didn't let her see that I did. Let me go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it. My first wife, Carol, died 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the last breath. We had 31 years together, a house in Columbus, a son named Daniel, who was 28 at the time, and a life that I had never once taken for granted. When she died, I didn't fall apart dramatically the way people do in movies. I just went very, very quiet. I sold the big house. I bought a smaller one. I went to work every morning, came home every evening, and learned how to cook for one person. Daniel called every Sunday. Life continued. I was okay. That was my mistake, maybe, thinking that okay was enough. 2 years after Carol passed, a colleague at the engineering firm where I was finishing out my final years before retirement introduced me to a woman at a company dinner. Her name was Diana Marsh. She was 51 years old, a widow herself, elegant in a way that was never showy, with a quiet laugh and a habit of listening, really listening when you spoke. She asked me about my work with genuine curiosity. She remembered details I mentioned in passing and brought them up weeks later. She lost her husband to a heart attack 4 years prior, she said. No children. She managed a small interior design business out of her home. She seemed, in every visible way, like someone who had survived grief and come out the other side with her warmth intact. I was careful. I want to say that clearly, because I know how this story sounds from the outside. I was not a foolish old man swept away overnight. We dated for 14 months before I proposed. I introduced her to Daniel. He was polite, warm even, and afterward he told me he thought she seemed nice. I had 2 friends from my engineering days, men I had known for over 20 years, meet her multiple times. Both of them liked her. I had no reason to doubt. We were married on a Saturday in April, 63 guests. Daniel gave a toast that made both Diana and me cry. She moved into my house. I was happy. The first thing I noticed was small. So small that I dismissed it twice before it lodged itself in the back of my mind and stayed there. About 4 months into the marriage, I went looking for a folder of financial documents I kept in the filing cabinet in my home office. Property records, retirement account statements, the original paperwork from Carol's life insurance payout, things I had organized carefully years ago. The folder was there, but the order was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just slightly off. The way things look when someone has gone through them and tried to put them back the way they found them but didn't quite succeed. I mentioned it to Diana. She said she had been looking for our homeowner's insurance policy and thought it might be in there. She laughed, apologized for disturbing my system, and that was the end of it. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? 3 weeks later, I got a call from my bank about a form I had supposedly submitted to add Diana as a joint account holder on my main checking account, the account where my retirement distributions landed every month. The bank representative was calling to confirm my intent and to let me know the paperwork had been processed. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat very still for a long moment, because I had never submitted that form. When I asked Diana about it that evening, she smiled with what I now understand was practiced calm, and said that she had mentioned wanting to be able to pay household bills without bothering me, and that I had agreed, and that she thought I remembered. Did I not remember? She wasn't pushy about it. She touched my arm and said it was probably just one of those things, and that we could remove her name if it made me uncomfortable. I said it was fine. I said I probably just forgot. But I had not forgotten. I have a very precise memory. 30 years of engineering work will do that to a man. I started paying attention differently after that, not confrontationally. Quietly, I began keeping my own copies of everything. I started noting dates. I mentioned things to Diana, small financial details, offhand, deliberately, and then watched to see what moved afterward. It was during this period that I called my accountant, a man named Phil who had handled my finances for 18 years, and asked him to pull together a full picture of my accounts and assets and walk me through everything. I told him nothing specific. I just said I wanted to review everything before a significant year-end. Phil called me back 2 days later. He had found 3 things that concerned him. The first was the joint account addition, which he already knew about. The second was a transfer request signed with my name that had been submitted to my brokerage account, attempting to liquidate a portion of my investment portfolio into a new account I did not recognize. The transfer had been flagged by the brokerage's fraud detection system and had not gone through, but it had been attempted. The third thing Phil found was a document my estate attorney had received, again signed with my name, requesting changes to my will. Changes that would make Diana the sole beneficiary of my entire estate, removing Daniel entirely. That was the morning Phil called me and said, "Robert, stop signing things." I want to be honest about what I felt in the moment after I set down that phone. I expected rage. What I actually felt was a deep, settling cold. The kind that comes when something you hoped wasn't true is confirmed beyond the possibility of denial. I thought of Carol, who would have seen through this in a week. I thought of Daniel. I thought of the house, the retirement fund, 31 years of work. And then I thought of what I was going to do about it. I did not confront Diana. I need you to understand why, because I know it seems like the obvious move, but I had no idea yet how far this had gone or who else was involved. If I confronted her and she panicked, she would destroy evidence. She would move money if she could. She would build a narrative in which I was the unstable one, the forgetful husband, the aging man who couldn't keep track of his own finances. I had seen enough of the world to know how that story could play out, so I smiled across the breakfast table and I waited. I called Daniel that evening from my car, parked down the street from my own house. I told him everything. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then he said, "Dad, how long has this been going on?" I said I didn't know the full shape of it yet. He asked me what I needed. I told him I needed him to trust me and stay calm and let me work through it carefully. He said he'd be on a plane the next morning. I told him not to come yet. I told him I needed 1 more week. It was during that week that the second layer of this thing revealed itself. And I will tell you honestly, even with everything I had already found, what I learned next knocked the ground out from under me in a way I was not prepared for. Phil had been doing more digging. He had hired, at my request and at my expense, a forensic accountant to trace the attempted transfer, the one that had been blocked. The new account that the money was meant to go into had been opened 3 months earlier. It was registered to a business entity called Marsh Meridian Holdings, LLC. Phil sent me the registration documents. Diana Marsh was listed as one of 2 principals. The other principal was a man named Gregory Farrell. I knew that name. I had met Gregory Farrell twice, at social events Diana had brought me to. He was introduced to me as an old friend of Diana's late husband. Charming man, maybe 45, well-dressed, the kind of person who makes you feel slightly underdressed without doing anything specific to cause that. I had thought nothing of him. There was no reason to. I hired a private investigator. Her name was Anita, and she was recommended by a retired detective I knew through a neighbor. Within 4 days, Anita had confirmed what I was beginning to suspect. Diana and Gregory Farrell had been in a relationship for at least 2 years, which meant they were together before I had ever met Diana. The interior design business Diana ran from her home, Gregory Farrell was the silent financial backer. The carefully constructed story of the grieving widow making her own way, it was a performance, a very good one, calibrated specifically to appeal to a man like me. Anita also found something that made my blood run cold. Diana's late husband, a man named Thomas Marsh, had died of what was officially recorded as a heart attack. He was 53. He had a significant life insurance policy. Diana collected it. There had been no investigation, no questions asked. Heart attacks happen, but Anita found something else. A former colleague of Thomas Marsh, a man who had been a close friend, had filed a complaint with the county sheriff's office 14 months after Thomas's death, stating that in the weeks before he died, Thomas had told him he was feeling persistently unwell, that he was experiencing unexplained fatigue and stomach problems, and that he suspected Diana was putting something in his food. The complaint was taken, logged, and apparently went nowhere. I sat in Anita's car in a parking lot outside a Kroger and read that report and understood that I was not dealing with a woman who had decided to take advantage of a lonely widower. I was dealing with someone who had done this before. I also understood, sitting in that parking lot, that the reason I had been feeling unusually tired over the past 2 months was not the stress of settling into a new marriage. I had attributed it to that. I had told my doctor at a routine visit that I was under more stress than usual and sleeping less soundly, and he had nodded and said it was common in the first year of a new marriage after a long period of living alone. He adjusted nothing. He said to call if things worsened. I called him the next morning and asked to come in that afternoon. I told him what I suspected. He referred me immediately to a toxicologist associated with the hospital. I want to tell you that the tests came back clean, and that I had been wrong about this particular part. But they didn't. The toxicologist found elevated levels of a compound in my blood work consistent with low-dose thallium exposure, a heavy metal, historically used in rat poison, capable of causing fatigue, neurological symptoms, and in sufficient quantities, organ failure. He said the levels in my blood suggested I had been ingesting small amounts over a period of weeks, possibly months. Not enough to kill me quickly, enough to make me sick gradually, to make me seem confused and forgetful, to lay the groundwork for a narrative in which I was declining cognitively and might benefit from having someone manage my affairs. I was not declining. I was being poisoned. My doctor called the police. I want to be clear. That call was made before I did anything else. I was not going to handle this myself like some kind of movie hero. I had the medical documentation. I had Phil's financial records. I had Anita's investigative report. I handed all of it to the two detectives who came to speak with me at the hospital, and I answered every question they had. They asked me to go home and behave normally for a few more days while they prepared. I agreed. This was the hardest part. I sat across from Diana at dinner, and I talked about ordinary things, the weather, a television show she liked, whether we should repaint the living room, and she smiled and passed me the salt. And I watched her, and I thought about Thomas Marsh, who had told his friend he was afraid and then had died before anything was done. Daniel flew in 4 days later. I had told him to come. Finally. We met at a coffee shop 2 miles from the house. He sat across from me, and I could see him trying to hold himself together. He's a steady young man, he gets that from Carol, but his jaw was tight the whole time I was talking. And when I got to the part about the toxicology results, he looked down at the table and was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked up and said, "Dad, are you okay?" Not meaning physically. I told him I was. He nodded. He believed me. And then he said, "What do we do now?" I told him the police had everything. I told him our job was to let the system work and stay out of the way. He didn't like that answer. He's not a patient man when the people he loves are threatened, but he accepted it because he trusted me. The detectives, meanwhile, had been busy. They had obtained a warrant for Diana's phone and laptop. On that laptop, they found email correspondence between Diana and Gregory Farrell spanning 3 years. In those emails were detailed discussions about my financial accounts, account numbers, balances, the structure of my estate. There were discussions of the will change. There were discussions of the transfer attempt that had been blocked. And there were 2 exchanges that the detectives considered significant enough to photograph and preserve as separate exhibits. In the first, Diana wrote to Gregory, "He's starting to seem off. The tiredness is working. Give it another month." In the second, written 6 weeks later, he asked Phil to review everything. "We may need to move faster or change the plan entirely." That second message was sent the day before Phil called me. They also found, in Gregory Farrell's phone records, 6 calls to the same number in the week after my bank had flagged the suspicious transfer. That number belonged to a notary public in a suburb of Columbus, a man named Dennis Schuler, who had, it turned out, notarized the forged signature on the will change request without ever meeting me, in exchange for a cash payment from Gregory. Schuler's bank records confirmed the cash deposit. He was charged separately. I was at Daniel's hotel room the morning the detectives called to tell me they were ready to move. It was a Thursday. Diana was at a yoga class, her usual Thursday morning routine. The detectives were waiting when she got home. So was a second unit that arrived simultaneously at Gregory Farrell's condo across the city. I was not there for the arrest. I had been advised not to be, and I agreed with that advice. I was told later by one of the detectives, who had the quiet satisfaction of someone who genuinely likes their work, that when Diana walked in and found them there, she went very still and looked immediately toward my office, as if checking whether I was there. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she asked if she could call her attorney. She could. She did. It didn't help her very much. The charges included fraud, forgery, attempted grand theft, and 2 counts related to the poisoning which the prosecutors pursued seriously given the Thomas Marsh complaint and the new toxicology evidence. That case, the one involving her late husband, was reopened. I learned later that they were able to recover meaningful evidence from Thomas Marsh's medical records and from interviews with people who had been close to him in the final months of his life. His former colleague, the man who had filed the original complaint years ago, was apparently emotional when the detective called him. He had spent years wondering if anyone would ever listen. The trial took 8 months to reach. I am not going to pretend those 8 months were easy. There was a period after the arrest where I had trouble sleeping, not from the thallium, which cleared my system, but from the particular loneliness of understanding how completely and deliberately you were deceived by someone you had trusted. I went back to therapy, which I had done briefly after Carol died. My therapist, a woman I had been seeing for 3 months at that point, said something to me that I've thought about often since. She said that being deceived by a skilled manipulator is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence that you were a person who trusted, which is not a flaw. The flaw belongs entirely to the one who exploited it. I wrote that down when I got home that evening. I put it on the notepad I keep by the kitchen table. I looked at it most mornings. Daniel came back to Columbus. Not permanently, he has his own life, his own career, his own apartment. But he came back more often. We started having Sunday dinners, the 2 of us, which is something we had not done regularly in years. Sometimes his girlfriend came. We talked about Carol sometimes. We talked about work. We ate poorly balanced meals and watched football and argued about the officiating in ways that served no purpose but felt genuinely good. I sold the house. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I bought a smaller one, a single story this time, in a neighborhood where I could walk to a coffee shop in the mornings. I took the retirement I had been 1 year away from and did not look back. On a cold Tuesday morning, 11 months after the arrest, I sat in a courtroom in Franklin County and listened as the judge delivered the verdict. Diana was convicted on 4 of the 6 charges, including both poisoning counts. Gregory Farrell was convicted on 3. Dennis Schuler, the notary, had already taken a plea deal. The judge, in sentencing Diana, noted the pattern of behavior, the prior complaint, the deliberate and extended nature of the fraud, and declined to take a lenient view. I did not feel triumphant sitting there. I want to be honest about that. I felt tired, and I felt something that was almost like grief, not for Diana, whom I had understood clearly by that point, but for the version of the story I had believed when I was standing at that altar. The one where I had simply, finally, gotten lucky enough to be happy again. But then Daniel put his hand briefly on my shoulder as we stood to leave, and I thought about Phil calling me on a Tuesday morning and saying 4 words. I thought about Thomas Marsh's friend, who had filed a complaint that went nowhere, and then waited years for someone to take it seriously. I thought about all the things that could have gone differently, the transfer that nearly went through, the will that nearly changed, the slow escalation of a dose that had been measured carefully to keep me just sick enough, just confused enough, to seem unreliable without raising immediate alarm. None of those things happened. I was slow to see it, but I saw it. I asked for help before it was too late. The people I trusted with that information, Phil, Anita, my doctor. Eventually, the police did exactly what I needed them to do. And the man who filed that complaint about Thomas Marsh had the courage to speak when no one was ready to listen. And because he did, his friend's death was not entirely without consequence. I walked out of that courthouse into a November afternoon, cold and bright, the kind of day that makes Columbus look better than it often gets credit for. Daniel walked beside me, and we didn't say much of anything for a while. We got coffee at a place near the parking garage. We sat by the window and watched people go past on the sidewalk, all of them busy, all of them with their own interior landscapes, their own versions of the stories they were living. After a while, Daniel said, "What are you going to do now, Dad?" I thought about it. I had been thinking about it for months, actually. I had a retirement with actual time in it now. I had a smaller house that felt more like a home than I had expected. I had Sunday dinners and a good therapist and a coffee shop I could walk to. I had my health back, fully, which is something I will never stop being grateful for. And I had the very specific kind of clarity that comes from having looked at something terrible directly, without flinching, and having dealt with it. I told Daniel I thought I was going to be just fine. He nodded. He looked at his coffee. Then he looked up with the particular expression he has inherited directly from his mother, skeptical affection. She always called it, and he said, "You're not going to start dating again anytime soon, right?" I laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere uncomplicated. "Give me a year," I said. He shook his head, but he was smiling. Outside, the November light was going that particular late afternoon gold that only happens in autumn, falling across the sidewalk and the passing cars, and the people who had no idea that two men sitting by a coffee shop window had just closed a chapter that had come far too close to having a very different ending. I watched it for a long time. I let myself feel it, the warmth of it, the ordinary beautiful fact of being alive on a cold afternoon with somewhere to be and someone to sit with. After everything, that was enough. After everything, that was more than enough.